The string quartet played softly in the corner of the country club ballroom as 300 guests turned their attention to the head table. My son David stood, his hand resting on his bride's shoulder, that confident smile I'd taught him to use when he wanted something spreading across his face. The same smile that had charmed teachers into better grades and convinced me to buy him his first car. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thank you all for being here today, he began, his voice carrying across the room with practiced ease. Before Melissa and I cut the cake, there's something we need to address. His eyes found mine across the room, and something cold settled in my stomach. My mother, Eleanor Walsh, has been struggling lately. The doctors say it's normal for someone her age, but the confusion, the memory lapses. He paused, letting the words sink in. We've made the difficult decision to move her into assisted living next month, for her own safety, of course. The room fell silent, except for the soft clink of champagne glasses and the rustle of silk. I sat perfectly still in my chair at table 12, not the head table where the mother of the groom traditionally sat, but relegated to the back with distant cousins and family friends. My hands remained folded in my lap, my expression serene, as if I hadn't just heard my own son announce my incompetence to everyone I'd ever known. But to understand why I was sitting there so calmly while my son destroyed my reputation, you'd need to know what happened 6 weeks before this moment. You'd need to know about the papers I'd found hidden in David's desk, the phone calls I'd overheard, and the plan that had been taking shape right under my nose. Most importantly, you'd need to understand that at 76 years old, I'd learned a thing or two about patience, preparation, and the sweet taste of justice served at exactly the right temperature. It started on a Tuesday morning in April when I arrived at David's house to pick up my granddaughter Sophie for her weekly sleepover. Sophie was 8, bright as a new penny, and the one pure joy in my life since my husband Robert had passed 3 years earlier. David lived in one of those sprawling suburban developments where every house looked identical except for the color of the shutters, but his was easy to spot because of Melissa's white Mercedes parked in the circular driveway like a monument to her own importance. I had my own key, of course. I'd been Sophie's primary caregiver since she was born, back when David was working 80-hour weeks at his law firm and his first wife, Amanda, was pursuing her medical residency. Even after their divorce 2 years ago, Sophie spent more time with me than with either parent. It was an arrangement that worked for everyone, especially David, who'd never been comfortable with the messier aspects of child-rearing. The house was quiet when I let myself in through the front door. Sophie wouldn't be home from school for another hour, and I'd planned to wait for her in the kitchen while catching up on my reading. I'd brought a mystery novel and a thermos of coffee, prepared to settle in for a comfortable afternoon. But as I made my way through the marble foyer, I heard voices coming from David's home office. The assessment is scheduled for next Friday. Dr. Richardson assured me it's just a formality. With her age and David's testimony about the incidents, there shouldn't be any problems. I stopped walking, my hand tightening on the handle of my purse. What assessment? What incidents? And you're sure this is the only way? David's voice, but strangely uncertain. Not the confident tone he used in courtrooms or at dinner parties. Darling, she's 76 years old and living alone in that enormous house. Do you know what could happen if she falls down those stairs or forgets to turn off the stove? We'd never forgive ourselves. Melissa's voice dripped with false concern, the same tone she used when explaining to Sophie why she couldn't have ice cream before dinner. I know, but she seems fine most of the time, sharp even. Yesterday, she helped Sophie with her math homework, stuff I couldn't figure out. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
The good days make the bad days more dangerous. She thinks she's capable of more than she is. David, I've seen this with my own grandmother. The denial is part of the disease. I pressed myself against the wall beside the door, my heart hammering so loud I was sure they'd hear it. Disease? What disease? Dr. Richardson says that with a diagnosis of early-stage dementia, the guardianship paperwork will be straightforward. We can have her placed somewhere safe within the month. Placed somewhere safe? The words hit me like a physical blow. They were talking about putting me in a care facility, against my will. What about Sophie? David asked. She spends every weekend with Mom. She'll be devastated. Sophie will adjust. Children are resilient. And honestly, David, do you really want her around someone whose mental state is declining? What if your mother forgets to watch her properly? What if she wanders off with Sophie in tow? There was a long pause, and when David spoke again, his voice had changed, hardened. I recognized that tone. It was the same one he'd used when he'd decided to divorce Amanda, when he'd switched law firms, when he'd made any major decision that required him to justify hurting people he was supposed to love. You're right. It's for the best, for everyone. I backed away from the door on trembling legs, my mind reeling. Guardianship paperwork? Early-stage dementia? A diagnosis I'd never received from any doctor I'd ever seen? Dr. Richardson wasn't even my physician. Dr. Martinez had been my doctor for 15 years, and at my last checkup 3 months ago, she'd pronounced me in excellent health for my age. I made it to the kitchen and sank into one of Melissa's pristine white chairs, my hands shaking as I tried to process what I'd just heard. They were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent. They were planning to take control of my life, my house, my relationship with Sophie. And they were going to do it by lying to a doctor I'd never met about symptoms I didn't have. The front door opened and Sophie's voice rang through the house like a bell. "Grandma Ellie!"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Are you here? I stood quickly, smoothing my skirt and forcing a smile. In the kitchen, sweetheart. Sophie bounded in, her backpack sliding off one shoulder, her dark hair escaping from the ponytail Melissa had put it in that morning. She looked exactly like David had at that age, all energy and curiosity and absolute trust in the adults around her. Can we make cookies today? The chocolate chip ones with the sea salt on top? Of course we can. I pulled her into a hug, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and trying to steady myself. Go get your overnight bag. We'll stop at the grocery store on the way to my house. As Sophie ran upstairs, I heard Melissa's heels clicking across the marble floor. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, perfectly put together as always in her designer workout clothes and full makeup. Even at 2 in the afternoon, she looked like she was ready for a photo shoot. "Eleanor, I didn't hear you come in." "Just got here. Sophie and I are heading out to do some shopping." Melissa's smile was bright and empty. "Actually, I was hoping to talk to you about something. David and I have been discussing Sophie's schedule, and we think it might be time to scale back her overnight visits. She's getting older, more involved in activities with friends her own age." My hands clenched at my sides. "Sophie loves our weekends together. She's never complained about missing activities." "Of course she hasn't. She adores you. But we have to think about what's best for her development. Too much time with elderly relatives can sometimes limit a child's social growth." Elderly relatives. As if I were some doddering old woman instead of someone who'd raised 3 children, run a successful catering business for 20 years, and maintained a household that put Melissa's sterile showcase to shame. "I see." I kept my voice level, pleasant. "Well, why don't we see how she feels about it? Children should have some say in these decisions." Something flickered behind Melissa's eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or calculation. "Of course, we'll discuss it as a family." Sophie clattered back down the stairs, her overnight bag bouncing against her hip. "Ready, Grandma?"
I took her hand and headed for the door, feeling Melissa's gaze following us. At the threshold, I turned back. "Oh, Melissa, I forgot to mention, I have an appointment with Dr. Martinez tomorrow, just my regular checkup. She always asks about family, how everyone's doing. I'll be sure to tell her how well you're all taking care of me." The smile froze on Melissa's face. "That's wonderful. Give her my best." In the car, Sophie chattered about her day at school, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. I listened and made appropriate responses, but my mind was racing. I had maybe a week before this Dr. Richardson appointment that would supposedly confirm my mental decline. A week to figure out how to protect myself, my home, and my relationship with Sophie. That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed in the guest room she'd claimed as her own, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and tried to think clearly. The house around me was quiet, except for the familiar sounds of settling wood and the hum of the refrigerator. This house where Robert and I had raised David and his two sisters, where we'd celebrated holidays and birthdays, where I'd planned to live out my remaining years in peace. I'd bought this house 45 years ago when David was Sophie's age. Robert had just gotten promoted to senior engineer, and we'd been giddy with the possibility of owning something real, something permanent. The house was old even then, built in the 1920s with real hardwood floors and crown molding and windows that let in light like benedictions. We'd put new plumbing and electrical, updated the kitchen twice, added the sunroom where I now kept my plants and did my morning yoga. Every room held memories. David's height marks penciled on the doorframe of the pantry, the small burn on the living room mantel where his sister Jennifer had left a candle burning too long during her rebellious teenage years, the garden where Robert had taught all three children to grow tomatoes, and where Sophie now planted marigolds every spring. They wanted to take all of this away from me and lock me in some sterile facility where I'd be fed institutional food and medicated into compliance, where I'd see Sophie maybe once a month, if I was lucky, for supervised visits that would gradually taper off as she grew older and forgot about her grandmother who'd become inconvenient. I pulled out my address book, the leather cover worn soft from years of use, and looked up a number I hadn't called in months. Patricia Hendricks answered on the second ring. "Eleanor, what a lovely surprise. How are you, dear?" Patricia had been my closest friend since our children were small, back when we'd taken turns carpooling to soccer practice and commiserated over the challenges of raising teenagers. She was also a retired family court judge who had presided over more guardianship cases than anyone in the county. "Eleanor, what a lovely surprise. How are you, dear?" "I'm well, Patricia, but I need some legal advice and I need it to be confidential." There was a pause. "Of course. What's going on?" I told her everything. The overheard conversation, the mysterious Dr. Richardson, the plan to have me declared incompetent. Patricia listened without interrupting, and I could hear her taking notes. "Eleanor, this is serious. If they've already scheduled an evaluation without your knowledge, they're moving fast. But you have rights, and you have options." "What kind of options?" "First, you need your own medical evaluation from a doctor you trust. Dr. Martinez, you said?"
Call her tomorrow and explain the situation. Get a complete neurological workup, cognitive testing, the works. Document your mental competency thoroughly. I wrote this down in the margin of my address book. What else? Second, you need to understand your financial situation completely. Joint bank accounts, property deeds, investment portfolios, everything. If David has power of attorney over anything, you need to revoke it immediately. My stomach clenched. David had convinced me to add him to my checking account 2 years ago, just in case of emergency. At the time, it had seemed practical. Third, you need legal representation, someone who specializes in elder law and guardianship disputes. I can give you some names. Patricia, what if they succeed? What if this Dr. Richardson declares me incompetent? Then you fight it. Guardianship isn't automatic, even with a medical diagnosis.
You have the right to legal representation, the right to contest the findings, the right to a hearing. But Eleanor, prevention is better than cure. The stronger your position going into this, the better your chances. After we hung up, I made a list of everything I needed to do. Call Dr. Martinez, review my financial accounts, find a lawyer, document my daily activities to prove my competency. It was nearly midnight by the time I finished writing, but I felt more clear-headed than I had since overhearing that conversation. The next morning, while Sophie was at school, I called Dr. Martinez's office. The receptionist tried to schedule me for the following week, but I insisted it was urgent. "Mrs. Walsh, is this a medical emergency?" the receptionist asked. "It's a legal emergency that requires medical documentation," I replied. That got me an appointment for that afternoon. Dr. Martinez was a small, energetic woman in her 50s who'd taken over the practice when my previous doctor retired. She'd always been thorough and direct, qualities I appreciated. "Eleanor, you said this was urgent. What's going on?" I explained the situation, watching her expression grow more serious with each detail. When I finished, she was shaking her head. "This is outrageous. You were here 3 months ago for your annual physical. Your blood pressure is excellent, your cholesterol levels are good, and you're scored perfectly on the cognitive screening I always do for patients over 70. There's absolutely no indication of dementia or any other cognitive decline." But what if this Dr. Richardson claims otherwise? Then Dr. Richardson is either incompetent or lying. "Eleanor, I want to do a comprehensive evaluation today. Blood work, cognitive testing, the full neurological battery. We'll document everything so thoroughly that no competent physician could dispute your mental capacity." The testing took 3 hours. Memory tests, problem-solving exercises, coordination assessments, blood work to rule out any underlying conditions that could affect cognitive function. Dr. Martinez was meticulous, explaining each test and what it measured. "Eleanor, your results are remarkable for someone your age. Your memory is sharp, your reasoning skills are excellent, and your physical health is outstanding. I'm going to document all of this and provide you with copies of everything." That evening, I sat Sophie down in the sunroom while she worked on her homework. The late afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting everything in a golden glow that made the room feel like a sanctuary. "Sweetheart, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." Sophie looked up from her math worksheet, her pencil poised in the air. "Okay. Have you noticed me acting strange lately? Forgetting things, getting confused, anything like that?" She considered this seriously, the way she approached all questions. "No, Grandma. You remember everything. You even remember which kids in my class have allergies when you pack my lunch for field trips. What about when we're cooking or doing activities? Do I ever seem confused or unsafe?" "Grandma, you're the one who teaches me how to be safe. You always make me wash my hands and check that the stove is off twice." She tilted her head, studying my face. "Why are you asking?" I smoothed her hair back from her face. "Just making sure I'm taking good care of you. You tell me if you are worried about anything, right?" "Of course. But Grandma, you don't need to worry. You're the smartest person I know. Even smarter than Dad, and he's a lawyer." That night, after Sophie was asleep, I called the first lawyer on Patricia's list. James Morrison specialized in elder law and had a reputation for being both brilliant and tenacious. His assistant scheduled me for an appointment the following morning. Morrison's office was in one of the old downtown buildings, the kind with high ceilings and solid wood furnishings that suggested permanence and reliability. Morrison himself was younger than I had expected, maybe 45, with silver threading through his dark hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Walsh, Judge Hendricks explained your situation."
This is more common than you might think, unfortunately. Adult children who see aging parents as obstacles to inheritance rather than people deserving of respect and autonomy. He reviewed the medical documentation Dr. Martinez had provided, nodding approvingly. "This is excellent, comprehensive, recent, and from your long-term physician. It would be very difficult for another doctor to contradict these findings without raising questions about their own competency." "What about the appointment with Dr. Richardson?" "You're under no legal obligation to keep that appointment. In fact, I'd advise against it. Any evaluation for guardianship proceedings should be conducted by a court-appointed neutral physician, not someone chosen by the petitioner. Morrison explained my rights in detail. If David and Melissa filed for guardianship, I would be notified and given the opportunity to contest it. I could present evidence of my competency, cross-examine their witnesses, and have legal representation throughout the process. But Mrs. Walsh, the best defense is a strong offense. We need to document not just your mental competency, but your active engagement with life, your relationship with your granddaughter, your management of household and financial affairs, your social connections. Paint a picture of someone who's not just competent, but thriving. Over the next week, I threw myself into documenting my life with the intensity I'd once brought to planning elaborate dinner parties. I kept detailed records of my daily activities, my financial transactions, my correspondence. I had lunch with old friends and made sure they knew about my situation. I volunteered at Sophie's school library and arranged for the librarian to write a letter about my reliability and mental acuity. Most importantly, I spent time with Sophie, but now with a heightened awareness of how precious and fragile our relationship was. Every bedtime story, every cooking lesson, every afternoon spent working in the garden felt like it might be among our last if David and Melissa succeeded in their plans. On Friday, the day I was supposed to meet with Dr. Richardson, I instead met with my financial advisor to review all my accounts and make sure David couldn't access them without my explicit permission. I revoked the power of attorney I'd granted him and changed the beneficiaries on my retirement accounts to include Sophie directly, with the funds to be held in trust until she turned 25. Mrs. Walsh, my advisor said, "These are significant changes. Are you sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." That evening, David called. His voice was strained, angry in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. "Mom, you missed your appointment with Dr. Richardson today. Melissa spent a lot of time setting that up." "I didn't make any appointment with Dr. Richardson. I've never even heard of him." "Don't play games with me. This is serious. We're concerned about your memory, your ability to live safely on your own." "I'm 76, David, not dead. My memory is fine, and I've been living safely on my own for 3 years since your father died." There was a pause, and I could hear muffled conversation in the background. Melissa coaching him, no doubt. "Look, Mom, we need to talk. Can you come over tomorrow? Without Sophie? This is adult conversation." "I'll be there at 2 o'clock. Saturday afternoon, I dressed carefully in my navy blue suit, the one I'd worn to court dates when I'd had to testify in cases involving my catering business. I wanted to look competent, professional, unshakable. I carried a leather portfolio containing all my medical and legal documentation. David and Melissa were waiting in their formal living room, the one with the uncomfortable furniture that Sophie wasn't allowed to touch. Melissa had set out coffee on her best china, as if we were having a pleasant social visit instead of a confrontation that would determine the rest of my life. "Mom, thanks for coming." David stood and kissed my cheek, but his embrace was stiff, perfunctory. "Sit down. We need to discuss some concerns." I took a seat in the wingback chair across from the sofa where they sat side by side, their hands clasped like a united front. "I'm listening." Melissa leaned forward, her expression carefully composed in what she assumed she thought looked like caring concern. "Eleanor, we've noticed some changes in you lately. Small things, but concerning when taken together." "What kind of changes?" "Forgetting conversations we've had, repeating yourself. Last month you told the same story about Sophie's school project 3 times in one afternoon." This was news to me. "What story?" David jumped in. "About her volcano project. You kept saying how proud you were of her presentation." I stared at him. "Sophie didn't do a volcano project last month. Her project was on butterflies, and she presented it in February. It's now April." A flush crept up David's neck. "See? This is exactly what we're talking about. The confusion about dates and events." "David, you're the one who's confused. Would you like me to call Sophie's teacher to confirm?" Melissa's smile tightened. "The point is, these little lapses are adding up. And living alone in that big house with all those stairs. I've lived in that house for 45 years. I know every creaky board and loose step.
But what if you fall? What if you have a medical emergency and there's no one there to help you? I opened my portfolio and pulled out Dr. Martinez's report. According to my physician, who examined me comprehensively this week, I'm in excellent health for my age. My balance is good, my reflexes are normal, and my cognitive function is outstanding. David barely glanced at the papers. Mom, one doctor's opinion, the opinion of my doctor, who I've been seeing for 15 years, who has my complete medical history and knows me well enough to recognize any changes in my condition. I set the papers on the coffee table between us. Unlike Dr. Richardson, who you scheduled me to see without my knowledge or consent. The room went very quiet. Melissa's coffee cup rattled slightly against its saucer when she set it down. "We're just trying to help," David said finally. "No, you're trying to control me. There's a difference." I pulled out more papers from my portfolio. These are records of my daily activities for the past week. Shopping lists, appointment schedules, correspondence, financial transactions, everything documented and organized. Does this look like the work of someone with dementia? Melissa's composed mask was starting to slip. "Eleanor, we understand that this is difficult to accept, but denial is part of the disease." "What disease? I've never been diagnosed with any cognitive condition. Dr. Martinez's evaluation rules out dementia, Alzheimer's, and any other form of mental decline." "We think you should get a second opinion," David said. "From Dr. Richardson, a physician I've never met, who you selected, who would evaluate me based on your reports of my alleged symptoms?" David's face flushed deeper. "We're family. We know you better than anyone." "Really? When's my birthday, David?" The question caught him off guard. "What?" "My birthday. If you know me so well, when is it?" He hesitated, looking to Melissa for help. "November 15th? December 3rd, same as it's been for 76 years. I gathered my papers and put them back in the portfolio. "David, I love you. You're my son, and despite everything, I want what's best for you. But I will not allow you to steal my life because it's convenient for you." I stood to leave, but Melissa's voice stopped me at the doorway. "Eleanor, if you don't cooperate with us, we'll have to take legal action. For your own protection." I turned back to face them, and for the first time since this conversation began, I smiled. "Melissa, dear, I certainly hope you do." On the drive home, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The confrontation I'd been dreading was over, and I'd held my ground. More importantly, I'd forced them to show their hand. They had revealed the weakness of their position, the lies they were planning to tell, and the contempt they felt for my intelligence. Now I knew exactly what I was fighting, and I had 6 weeks to prepare my counterattack. The wedding invitation arrived 3 weeks later, embossed with gold lettering on cream-colored cardstock. "Mr. and Mrs. David Walsh request your presence." I almost laughed at the presumption. They were inviting me to watch my son marry the woman who was trying to destroy my life, and they expected me to smile and applaud. But as I studied the invitation, an idea began to form. A wedding was a public event, a celebration where families came together to witness the union of two people who promised to love and honor each other. It was also a place where reputations were made and unmade, where family dynamics played out in front of everyone who mattered. What if instead of trying to avoid the confrontation Melissa was forcing, I embraced it? What if I used their own celebration as the stage for my vindication? I RSVP'd immediately. I would be delighted to attend. The next few weeks flew by in a blur of preparation. I consulted with James Morrison about the legal implications of what I was planning.
I met with Patricia to get her advice on strategy and timing. I even bought a new dress, an elegant blue silk that complemented my silver hair and made me look like the dignified matriarch I intended to be. Most importantly, I spent time with Sophie, knowing that after the wedding, everything would change. David and Melissa would either back down from their plans or they would escalate their attacks. Either way, Sophie would be caught in the middle, and I needed her to understand what was happening before other people started telling them their version of the truth. "Sweetheart," I said one afternoon while we were baking cookies, "after Dad's wedding, things might be different for a while." Sophie looked up from the cookie dough she was rolling. "Different how?"
Melissa doesn't think you should spend so much time with me. She thinks you need to focus more on making friends your own age. Sophie's face crumpled. But I don't want to stop staying with you. This is my favorite place in the whole world. I pulled her into a flowery hug. It's my favorite place too. And no matter what happens, no matter what anyone says, I want you to remember that you will always be welcome here. This will always be your home too. Are you and Daddy fighting? Sometimes adults disagree about what's best, even when they love each other. Your dad thinks I'm getting too old to take care of myself properly. That's silly. You take better care of yourself than anybody. You eat vegetables and exercise and go to the doctor for checkups. I know that, and you know that. Sometimes other people need to be reminded. The week before the wedding, David called to discuss the seating arrangements. "Mom, Melissa thought you might be more comfortable at a table with the other older relatives, Uncle Jerry and Aunt Ruth, some of Dad's cousins." The other older relatives. People David barely saw except at funerals. People who'd be easy to convince that I was failing if the topic came up in conversation. "Actually, David, I'd prefer to sit with the Martinez family. Dr. Martinez and her husband are coming, aren't they?" There was a pause. "Yes, but..." "Perfect. I've known them for years, and we'll have plenty to talk about. Like my recent comprehensive medical evaluation and my excellent cognitive test scores." "David, I don't think that's..." "David, it's your wedding. You should be focused on celebrating with Melissa, not worrying about where your competent, independent mother sits for dinner." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for the outdoor ceremony Melissa had planned. I dressed carefully in my blue silk dress and the pearl necklace Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who'd raised 3 children, run a successful business, and survived the death of her life partner. I looked like someone who deserved respect. The country club was decorated with white flowers and flowing fabric, everything pristine and expensive and utterly without personality. Melissa's style, in other words. I arrived early and took my assigned seat next to Dr. Martinez, who squeezed my hand warmly when I sat down. "Eleanor, you look wonderful. How are you feeling?" "Strong," I replied, ready for anything. The ceremony itself was beautiful, I had to admit. David looked handsome in his black tuxedo, and Melissa was radiant in her designer gown. For a moment, watching my son pledge his love and fidelity, I almost forgot about the battle we'd been waging. Almost. But then came the reception, and Melissa's careful choreography began to unfold. The table assignments that grouped me with the elderly, the whispered conversations that stopped when I approached, the way certain people looked at me with pity, as if I were already gone. During the cocktail hour, I overheard 2 of David's law partners discussing my situation. Tragic, really. David's been struggling with it for months. She refuses to admit there's a problem. It's so difficult when they lose their insight. My mother was the same way. I walked up to them with a bright smile. "Gentlemen, how lovely to see you. Are you enjoying the party?" They looked uncomfortable, probably wondering how much I'd heard. "Mrs. Walsh, congratulations. Your son is a lucky man." "Thank you. I'm so proud of David. He's learned so much over the years about strategy and planning ahead. I taught him well." By the time dinner was served, I could feel the undercurrent of conversation around me. The guests had been prepared for this evening to include a revelation about the elderly mother who needed to be managed for her own good. They were waiting for me to fulfill their expectations. I didn't have to wait long for my cue.
The main course was being served when David stood up, tapping his crystal wine glass with a silver spoon. The gentle chiming sound carried across the ballroom, and conversations gradually faded as 300 guests turned their attention to the head table. I remained seated at my assigned table, my hands folded calmly in my lap, watching my son prepare to deliver what he thought would be his masterstroke. Melissa beamed up at him from her seat, her hand resting possessively on his arm. She'd changed into her reception dress, a flowing champagne-colored gown that complemented the ballroom's elegant decor. Everything about this moment was carefully orchestrated, from the timing of the toast to the sympathetic expression David wore as he surveyed the room. I caught Dr. Martinez's eye across our table. She raised her eyebrows slightly, a question in her expression. I gave her the smallest nod. She'd read the medical reports. She knew what was coming. "Thank you all for being here tonight," David began, his voice carrying the practiced authority he'd developed over years of courtroom appearances. "Melissa and I are overwhelmed by your love and support as we begin this new chapter of our lives together."
Polite applause rippled through the room. I noticed how he emphasized our lives together, already building the narrative that he and Melissa were a team facing challenges together. Marriage is about partnership, about supporting each other through difficult times and celebrating the joyful ones. It's also about family, about taking care of the people we love most. His eyes found mine across the room, and I felt the temperature drop several degrees. Which brings me to something personal that Melissa and I need to share with all of you tonight. The room went completely silent. Even the waitstaff stopped moving, sensing the shift in atmosphere. This was it, the moment Melissa had been building toward for months. My mother, Eleanor Walsh, has been the foundation of our family for as long as I can remember. She raised 3 children, built a successful business, and has been Sophie's devoted grandmother. His voice carried just the right note of affection mixed with concern. But recently, we've noticed some changes that have us worried. I saw heads turning toward my table, expressions of curiosity and sympathy forming on familiar faces. David had learned his lessons well. Build credibility first, establish love and respect, then deliver the devastating blow. The doctors have confirmed what we feared. Mom is showing early signs of cognitive decline, memory lapses, confusion about dates and events, difficulty managing daily tasks that used to be second nature to her. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. I heard someone whisper, "Oh, how awful," and saw tears forming in the eyes of women who'd known me for decades. David let the moment settle, allowing the tragedy of his words to sink in. We've made the difficult decision to move her into a care facility where she'll be safe and receive the specialized attention she needs. It breaks our hearts, but we have to think about her well-being, especially with Sophie to consider. The whispers grew louder. I caught fragments of conversation from nearby tables. So young. What a blessing that David is so responsible. Poor little Sophie. Melissa squeezed David's hand supportively, playing her role perfectly, the grieving daughter-in-law, burdened with the responsibility of caring for a declining mother-in-law. Several guests were nodding approvingly at their mature handling of such a difficult situation. "This is the last time we'll all be together like this as a family," David continued, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. "So I want to toast my mother tonight, for everything she's given us, and for trusting us to make the right decisions for her future." He raised his glass, and 300 people followed suit. The crystal caught the chandelier light, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the white tablecloths. It was a beautiful moment, touching and dignified, and completely fraudulent. "To Eleanor Walsh, who taught us the meaning of family," the toast echoed across the ballroom. "To Eleanor." I sat perfectly still as glasses were raised in my honor, as people drank to my memory while I was still very much alive and present. The obituary toast, delivered by my own son at his wedding reception. It was breathtaking in its cruelty and brilliant in its execution. David set down his glass and looked directly at me, expecting to see defeat, confusion, perhaps tears. Instead, I smiled at him with genuine warmth.
and began to applaud. Slow, deliberate claps that carried clearly in the sudden quiet of the room. The applause caught David off guard. He'd expected collapse, not celebration. Guests began to clap along with me, uncertain but following my lead. The sound built gradually, filling the ballroom with the kind of appreciation usually reserved for genuinely moving moments. I stood slowly, my napkin sliding from my lap to the floor in an unconscious echo of another evening, another confrontation. The room fell silent again as I moved with careful dignity toward the microphone David had abandoned. Thank you, David, for those kind words, and thank you all for that lovely toast. Since we're sharing family news tonight, and since David has been so generous with his concern for my well-being, I'd like to take this opportunity to address some misconceptions that have been circulating. I could see David's face draining of color. Melissa had gone rigid in her chair, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. They'd expected me to flee in humiliation, not commandeer their microphone. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Martinez, who's here tonight at table 12, for the comprehensive neurological evaluation she conducted last week at my request. I gestured toward my physician, who raised her hand with a small wave. Dr. Martinez, would you mind sharing your findings with our friends? Dr. Martinez stood gracefully, her professional demeanor commanding immediate respect. Certainly, Eleanor. Mrs. Walsh scored in the 95th percentile on all cognitive assessments. Her memory, reasoning ability, and executive function are all excellent for someone of any age, much less 76. There is absolutely no indication of dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or any other form of cognitive decline. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I saw faces that moments ago had been filled with sympathy for David's burden. Dr. Martinez remained standing, her presence lending medical authority to my defense. Thank you, doctor. I should also mention that this evaluation was prompted by some unusual circumstances. 3 weeks ago, I discovered that my son and daughter-in-law had scheduled me for an evaluation with a physician I'd never met, based on symptoms I've never experienced, for a guardianship proceeding I knew nothing about. The murmurs grew louder. Several guests were looking back and forth between David and me like spectators at a tennis match. I could see David frantically calculating whether to interrupt me or let me continue hanging myself with my own rope. I found this concerning enough to consult with my attorney, James Morrison, who specializes in elder law. Mr. Morrison, who's also here tonight, helped me understand my rights and options when family members attempt to have competent adults declared mentally incapacitated. James stood from his table near the back of the room, his presence adding legal authority to medical authority. I was building my own credibility now, surrounding myself with professional witnesses who could contradict David's narrative.
But what troubled me most wasn't the attempt to control my living situation or my finances. What broke my heart was the plan to limit my relationship with my granddaughter Sophie, based on the false premise that I pose some kind of danger to her well-being. I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the room. I saw Sophie's second-grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, looking shocked. The school librarian where I volunteered weekly was shaking her head in dismay. These were people who saw me regularly, who knew my capabilities firsthand. Sophie, sweetheart, would you come up here for a moment? Sophie had been sitting at the children's table near the front, looking confused by the adult drama unfolding around her. She approached the microphone hesitantly, probably unsure whether she was in trouble or being honored. Sophie, some people are worried that I might not be safe to be around, that I might forget important things or make mistakes that could hurt you. What do you think about that? Sophie looked out at the room full of adults waiting for her answer, then back at me. Grandma, that's silly. You're the safest person I know. You always make me wear my seatbelt and look both ways before crossing streets, and you never let me climb on chairs to reach high things. What about my memory? Do I forget things that are important? You remember everything.
You remember which of my friends have peanut allergies, and you remember to pack my inhaler when we go places, and you remember every single story about my school day. Sophie's voice was getting stronger, more confident. You remember more things than Daddy does. A few people chuckled at that. David's face was now completely pale, and Melissa looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Thank you, sweetheart. You can go back to your table now. I waited until Sophie was seated again before continuing. I'd also like to share some documentation that might interest you all. I pulled out a manila folder I'd kept hidden beside my chair. These are records of my daily activities over the past month. Shopping lists with receipts showing I can manage financial transactions. Correspondence with various organizations where I volunteer. Medical appointment records showing I keep track of my healthcare independently. I held up a thick stack of papers. Bank statements showing I manage my finances competently, investment records demonstrating I make sound financial decisions, insurance policies I've renewed and updated appropriately. The documentation was impressive even at a distance, organized, thorough, and clearly the work of someone in full command of their faculties. But perhaps most importantly, I have this. I pulled out the final document, holding it high enough for everyone to see. A signed affidavit from Judge Patricia Hendricks, retired from family court, who has reviewed all of my medical and legal records. Judge Hendricks confirms that I am fully competent to make my own decisions and that any attempt to impose guardianship without clear evidence of incapacity would constitute elder abuse under state law. The ballroom was completely silent now. Even the catering staff had stopped moving. 300 people were absorbing the reality that they'd just witnessed an attempted character assassination based entirely on lies. Now, I want to address something David said about this being our last time together as a family. He's absolutely right about that, though not for the reasons he thinks. I turned to face David directly, speaking to him rather than the crowd. David, I am your son, and I will always love you. But what you and Melissa attempted to do to me crosses a line that can't be uncrossed. You tried to steal my independence, my home, my relationship with Sophie, and my reputation, all based on fabricated evidence and false medical claims. David started to stand, probably to object or try to take control of the situation, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. You scheduled medical appointments without my knowledge or consent. You told people I was mentally declining when you knew it wasn't true. You planned to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized against my will. These aren't the actions of a concerned son. They're the actions of someone who sees his aging mother as an obstacle to his inheritance. The weight of what I was saying settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Guests were staring at David with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. This wasn't how wedding receptions were supposed to go. Melissa, I want to thank you for being so transparent about your motives. Your comment about Sophie needing to spend time with people her own age instead of elderly relatives was particularly illuminating. Your concern for my safety while living alone was touching, especially since you've never once visited my home to assess these dangers for yourself. Melissa, you're taking everything out of context. We're only trying to help. Help with what? According to my doctor, I'm in excellent health. According to my financial advisor, I manage my money better than most people half my age. According to Sophie's teachers, I'm a model grandparent who contributes positively to her education and well-being. I gestured towards the crowd of witnesses. According to the dozen people in this room who interact with me regularly, I'm sharp, reliable, and fully capable of independent living. So, what exactly are you helping me with? The question hung in the air unanswered. David and Melissa couldn't explain their concern without admitting it was manufactured. I'll tell you what you were helping with. You were helping yourselves to my assets, my property, and my parental rights over Sophie when she stays with me. You were helping David inherit early while avoiding the inconvenience of actually caring for an aging parent. Several guests gasped audibly. The accusation was harsh but supported by everything I just revealed. The pattern was clear: manufactured crisis, false medical claims, rushed legal proceedings, and financial benefit for the accusers. David, you learned strategy and planning from me, but you forgot the most important lesson I tried to teach you. There's a difference between being smart and being wise. Smart is knowing how to manipulate a situation to get what you want. Wise is understanding that some victories cost more than they're worth. I picked up my purse and the folder of documentation, preparing to leave, but I had one more thing to say, and I wanted the entire room to hear it. To everyone who raised their glasses to toast my memory tonight, thank you. But I'm not gone yet, and I'm not going anywhere.
I'll continue living independently in my own home, managing my own affairs, and being Sophie's grandmother for as long as she wants me in her life. I walked towards the exit, my heels clicking steadily against the marble floor. Behind me, I could hear the explosion of conversation as 300 people tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Phones were already coming out as guests began calling friends and family to share the most traumatic wedding reception story they'd ever experienced. At the ballroom entrance, I paused and looked back. David was still standing at the head table, frozen in place like a statue. Melissa had buried her face in her hands. Sophie was looking around the room with wide eyes, trying to understand why all the adults seemed so upset. I caught Sophie's eye and blew her a kiss. She smiled and waved back, the only genuinely happy expression in the entire room. James Morrison appeared at my elbow. Eleanor, that was magnificent. Risky, but magnificent. Was it too much? For anyone trying to claim you're mentally declining? Absolutely. No one who witnessed that performance could ever believe you lacked the capacity to make your own decisions. Dr. Martinez joined us in the lobby. Eleanor, I have to say, as your physician, I was initially concerned about the stress of public confrontation, but watching you handle that situation, I think your mental health has never been better. We walked together toward the parking garage, leaving behind the chaos I'd created. I felt lighter with each step, as if I'd been carrying a weight I didn't realize was there. What happens now? I asked James. Now? Now we wait and see how they respond. They can't proceed with guardianship after tonight. Too many witnesses, too much documentation of your competency. They'd be laughed out of court. What about Sophie? That's more complicated. Legally, David has custody, but after tonight, he'll have a hard time arguing that you're an unfit influence. Any judge who heard about this would be skeptical of his motives. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, in my own house, with sunlight streaming through the windows I'd chosen and curtains I'd hung myself. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely at peace. Sophie called around 10 o'clock. Her voice was subdued, younger sounding than usual. Grandma Allie, Daddy says we need to talk about what happened at the wedding. What would you like to talk about, sweetheart? Did Daddy really try to send you away? I closed my eyes, choosing my words carefully. Your daddy was worried about me living alone. He thought I might be safer somewhere else with other people to help take care of me. But you don't need help taking care of yourself. That's what I tried to explain to him. There was a pause, and I could hear muffled voices in the background. David or Melissa, coaching her probably. Daddy says I can't come stay with you anymore because you might get confused and forget to watch me properly. My heart clenched. Sophie, what do you think about that? Do you feel unsafe when you're with me? No, I feel safest when I'm with you. You never forget anything important, and you always know where I am and what I'm doing. Her voice got smaller. I don't want to stop staying with you, Grandma. I don't want that either, sweetheart. But right now, your daddy gets to make decisions about where you spend your time. That's not fair. No, it's not. But sometimes life isn't fair, and we have to figure out how to handle it anyway. More muffled conversation in the background. Then Sophie's voice again, clearly reading from something. Daddy wants me to ask if you're mad at me. The manipulation was breathtaking. Using a child to gauge my emotional state, making her responsible for adult conflicts she couldn't understand. Sophie, listen to me very carefully. I am not mad at you. I will never be mad at you for things that grown-ups do.
You are not responsible for fixing problems between adults, and you don't have to choose sides between people who love you. Okay, she sounded relieved. Can I still call you? You can call me anytime you want, and if your daddy tries to stop you, you tell him that your grandmother said it's important for children to maintain relationships with people who love them. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and tried to think practically about the situation. David would likely try to control Sophie's access to me, using her as leverage to force my compliance with their original plan. They couldn't pursue guardianship after last night's debacle, but they could make my life miserable in other ways. The phone rang again around noon. David's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Mom, what you did last night was unforgivable. You humiliated Melissa and me in front of everyone we know." I told the truth, David. If that was humiliating, perhaps you should examine why. You made us look like villains, like we were trying to steal from you or hurt you somehow. Weren't you? We were trying to help. We were trying to make sure you're safe and cared for. By lying to doctors about my mental state?
By scheduling evaluations without my knowledge? By planning to institutionalize me against my will? There was a pause. You're twisting everything, making it sound worse than it was. David, I heard you talking to Melissa. You said I'd sign anything you put in front of me because I wouldn't understand what it was. You said the town would never challenge your decisions because they'd assume I was incompetent. Those were your exact words. You were eavesdropping. I was in my own son's house, where I've been welcome for 8 years. I didn't expect to overhear plans for my own destruction. It wasn't destruction. It was protection. From what, my granddaughter? David's voice got harder. From yourself, Mom. From the risks that come with aging alone. What risks? Be specific. What dangerous behaviors have you observed? What evidence do you have that I'm unsafe or incapable? The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Finally, he spoke again, but his voice had changed. Less angry, more calculated. This isn't over, Mom. Sophie is my daughter, and I have the right to decide who influences her development. Yes, you do. But Judge Patterson, who handles custody modifications in family court, is a personal friend of Patricia Hendricks, and Judge Patterson was at the wedding last night. Another long pause. David was smart enough to understand the implications. Any attempt to restrict my access to Sophie would now look like retaliation for my public exposure of their scheme. You think you're so clever, he said finally. I think I'm a survivor. I've buried parents, lost a husband, raised 3 children, and built a life worth protecting. I didn't do all of that just to hand it over to someone who thinks love is something you can foreclose on. He hung up without saying goodbye. That afternoon, Patricia called to check on me. Eleanor, I heard about last night from 6 different people. You've become something of a local legend. Good or bad? Oh, definitely good. Everyone's talking about how composed you were, how thoroughly you'd prepared your defense. There's a certain satisfaction in watching someone who underestimated you realize their mistake. I just hope it doesn't backfire. David's angry, and when he's angry, he makes impulsive decisions. What can he do? He can't pursue guardianship after that public demonstration of your competency. He'd be laughed out of court. He can limit my access to Sophie. That's the one thing he still controls. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, there are legal options if he tries to use Sophie as a weapon. Grandparents have rights, especially when there's been an established relationship and the restriction is clearly retaliatory. I don't want to put Sophie in the middle of a custody battle. You're not putting her there, David is. You're just protecting your right to maintain a relationship that benefits her as much as it does you. Over the next few days, the phone rang constantly. Old friends calling to express their support, neighbors checking in to see if I needed anything, former catering clients telling me how proud they were of how I'd handled myself. The story had spread throughout the community, growing in the telling, until I'd become some kind of folk hero for elderly rights. Mrs. Patterson from Sophie's school called on Thursday. Mrs. Walsh, I hope you don't mind me contacting you directly. I wanted you to know that Sophie seems unusually withdrawn this week. She's not participating in class discussions the way she normally does. Has she said anything about what's happening at home?
Not directly, but when we were doing our family tree project, she asked if she could include you, even though her father said you weren't really part of the family anymore. My heart broke a little. What did you tell her? I told her that love makes families, not just biology or legal documents, and that anyone who loves her as much as you do will always be part of her family tree. That evening, Sophie called again. This time her voice was stronger, more determined. Grandma Ellie, I told Daddy I want to keep staying with you on weekends. What did he say? He said, maybe when I'm older I can make those decisions for myself, but right now he has to protect me from people who might not be able to take care of me properly. How do you feel about that? I feel like Daddy doesn't trust me to know who takes good care of me, and I feel like he doesn't trust you even though you've never done anything wrong. Sometimes adults make decisions based on their fears rather than the facts, sweetheart. Your daddy loves you very much and he wants to keep you safe. He just disagrees with me about what safety looks like. But Grandma, you're the one who taught me about safety. You're the one who made me learn my address and phone number and what to do if I get lost.
How can keeping me away from you make me safer? Out of the mouths of babes. Sophie had identified the central contradiction in David's position more clearly than most of the adults involved. That's a very good question, Sophie. Maybe you should ask your daddy to explain it to you. The following Monday, James Morrison called with news. Eleanor, David's attorney, contacted me. They want to arrange a meeting to discuss what they call a reasonable compromise. What kind of compromise? They didn't give specifics, but the fact that they're asking for a meeting suggests they understand their position is weak. They're looking for a face-saving way to back down. And if I refuse to meet? Then they'll probably escalate, which could mean more publicity, more legal costs, and more stress for everyone involved, especially Sophie. I thought about Sophie's withdrawn behavior at school, her questions about family trees and safety and trust. Whatever happened between David and me, she was the one who would pay the price for our conflict. Set up the meeting. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon at James Morrison's office. I arrived early, wanting to be settled and composed when David and Melissa walked in. James had arranged for Patricia to be present as well, partly for moral support and partly because her judicial background would add weight to any agreements we reached. David looked like he hadn't slept well in days. His usual polished appearance was slightly rumpled, his tie not quite straight. Melissa seemed to be maintaining her composure better, but I could see tension in the way she held her shoulders. Their attorney was a sharp-dressed woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Sarah Chen. She spread several documents across the conference table and began with what I assumed was her opening position. My clients want to resolve this situation amicably, in the best interests of everyone involved, especially Sophie. James nodded politely. We're here to listen. Mr. and Mrs. Walsh acknowledged that the guardianship proceedings were premature. They're prepared to withdraw all petitions and agree not to pursue that avenue in the future without clear medical evidence of incapacity. That's a start, Patricia said dryly. Sarah continued. In exchange, Mrs. Eleanor Walsh would agree to certain reasonable accommodations regarding her living situation and her relationship with Sophie. I kept my expression neutral. What kind of accommodations? A home health aide for a few hours each week just to assist with housekeeping and ensure someone checks on your well-being regularly. Modified visitation with Sophie, perhaps one weekend day instead of overnight stays, with the understanding that as Sophie gets older, she may prefer activities with friends her own age. The offer was clever. It addressed their stated concerns about my safety while giving them some control over my relationship with Sophie. It also included language that would allow them to further restrict access as Sophie grew up. And if I don't agree to these accommodations? Melissa spoke for the first time since entering the room. Then we maintain the current restrictions on Sophie's visits and we evaluate the situation periodically based on your health and capacity. It was a threat wrapped in reasonable language. Agree to some limitations or face complete exclusion from Sophie's life. I looked at the documents Sarah had prepared, noting their thoroughness and legal precision. They'd clearly expected this negotiation and had come prepared with multiple fallback positions. I have a counter-proposal, I said finally. James raised an eyebrow. We hadn't discussed this, but he trusted my judgment enough to let me proceed.
I agree to a quarterly medical evaluation by Dr. Martinez, with results shared with David and Melissa to document my continued capacity for independent living. Sarah began writing notes. That seems reasonable. I agree to update my emergency contact information and ensure David has access to my medical records in case of actual emergency. More notes. This was all reasonable, the kind of thing any responsible adult child might want. I agree to consider a home health aide if Dr. Martinez recommends one based on her evaluations, not based on anyone else's assumptions about what I need. David looked hopeful. This was more cooperation than he probably had expected. And in exchange, I continued, my relationship with Sophie continues unchanged. Overnight visits, participation in school activities, involvement in her daily life exactly as it has been for 8 years. Mrs. Walsh, Sarah began, my clients have legitimate concerns about what? About my demonstrably excellent health? About my well-documented competency? About my granddaughter's clear preference for maintaining our relationship? I pulled out my own documents of documents. I have letters from Sophie's teachers, her pediatrician, her school counselor, all confirming that my involvement in her life is beneficial to her development and well-being. I have documentation of every activity we have shared, every educational opportunity I have provided, every way I have contributed to her growth and happiness. I spread the letters across the table. I also have character references from 12 community members who interact with me regularly, all confirming my mental acuity and reliable judgment. I have financial records showing I manage my affairs competently, medical records showing I maintain my health responsibly, and legal documentation confirming my capacity to make sound decisions. Sarah was reading the letters, her expression growing more serious with each page. Patricia was watching David and Melissa, gauging their reactions to the strength of my position. Most importantly, I continued, I have something David and Melissa don't have. I have 8 years of documented, consistent, loving care for Sophie. I have her trust, her affection, and her explicit desire to maintain our relationship. I looked directly at David. What you have is a failed attempt to fabricate a crisis that doesn't exist based on symptoms I don't have, diagnosed by a doctor I've never met. What you have is a public record of trying to manipulate an elderly family member for personal gain. What you have is a granddaughter who now questions whether she can trust your motives. The room fell silent. Sarah was relieving her notes, probably calculating the weakness of her client's negotiating position. David was staring at the table, his face flushed with embarrassment or anger. Melissa looked like she wanted to flee.
Patricia leaned forward slightly. Perhaps we should focus on what's actually best for Sophie, rather than what's convenient for the adults in her life. What's best for Sophie, I said, is maintaining stability in her relationships while her parents navigate their new marriage and combined household. What's best for Sophie is having access to all the people who love her, without being forced to choose sides or manage adult conflicts. I gathered my documents and put them back in my folder. My final offer is simple. You withdraw all restrictions on my relationship with Sophie. You agree not to pursue guardianship without genuine medical evidence, and you acknowledge publicly that your concerns about my competency were unfounded. And in exchange? Sarah asked. In exchange, I don't file elder abuse charges against you for attempted financial exploitation and emotional harm. I don't pursue damages for the stress and humiliation you've caused me. And I don't request a formal investigation into your fitness as Sophie's guardians. The threat was subtle but clear. I had grounds for legal action that could be far more damaging to their reputations and finances than anything they could do to me. David finally looked up from the table. Mom, this is getting out of hand. Can't we just go back to the way things were? No, David, we can't. Because the way things were included you plotting behind my back to destroy my life. The way things were included you lying to people about my mental health and planning to institutionalize me against my will. I stood up, preparing to leave. The way things were was based on your assumption that I was too weak or too stupid to defend myself.
That assumption was wrong. So what happens now? Melissa asked, her voice small and strained. Now, you decide whether you want to be the people who tried to steal from an elderly family member, or whether you want to be the people who made a mistake and had the wisdom to correct it. I walked toward the door, then paused and looked back. I'll be at home this evening if Sophie wants to call, and I'll be expecting her for our usual weekend together, unless you want to explain to a family court judge why you're keeping a child away from a loving grandmother who poses no threat to her well-being. The drive home felt like emerging from a long tunnel into sunlight. I'd done everything I could to protect my independence and my relationship with Sophie. The rest was up to David and Melissa. That evening, Sophie called just as I was finishing dinner. Her voice bubbled with excitement in a way I hadn't heard since before the wedding. "Grandma Ellie, Daddy says I can come stay with you this weekend after all." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. What changed his mind?" "I think Melissa talked to him. She said sometimes grown-ups make mistakes when they're trying to protect people they love, and the important thing is being brave enough to fix the mistakes." I felt a flicker of surprise and, despite everything, gratitude toward Melissa. Whatever had happened in that meeting after I left, she'd found a way to frame the resolution that preserved everyone's dignity while giving Sophie what she needed to hear. "That sounds very wise," I said. "Can we make cookies this weekend? The chocolate chip ones with sea salt?" "Of course we can. We can make whatever you want." After we hung up, I sat in my living room surrounded by the familiar sounds and sights of home. The grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the soft hum of the furnace, the late afternoon light filtering through windows I'd cleaned just that morning, my books on their shelves, my photographs on their tables, my memories embedded in every corner of every room. I thought about Robert, who would have been both proud and amused by the whole situation. He'd always said I was tougher than I looked, that anyone who underestimated me did so at their own peril. He would have loved hearing about David's face when I took control of that microphone at the wedding reception. The phone rang again. David's voice was subdued, formal, but not hostile. "Mom, I want you to know that Melissa and I have discussed everything, and we've decided to drop all the restrictions on your time with Sophie. Thank you. I also want to apologize for the way we handled things. We were wrong to go behind your back, and we were wrong to make assumptions about your capacity." It wasn't a complete apology. It didn't acknowledge the deliberate deception or the emotional harm they had caused me. But it was a start. "I appreciate that, David. Can we try to move forward from here, for Sophie's sake?" "We can try, but David, trust is like a china plate. Once it's broken, it's never quite the same, even after you glue it back together." "I understand." After we hung up, I made myself a cup of tea and sat down to write in the journal I'd been keeping throughout this ordeal. Future historians of the Walsh family would need to understand what had happened, why it had happened, and how it had been resolved. But as I wrote, I realized this wasn't just a story about one family's conflict. It was a story about dignity, about the right to determine your own fate, about the courage to fight back when people tried to diminish you. 6 months later, I was frosting Sophie's 9th birthday cake in my own kitchen when the doorbell rang. Through the window, I saw David standing on my porch holding a small wrapped gift. "Mom," he said when I opened the door, "I know Sophie's party isn't until tomorrow, but I wanted to give you this first." Inside the box was a silver picture frame containing a photo from Sophie's school play the month before. She was dressed as a tree, beaming with pride, and I was sitting in the front row applauding. Someone had captured the moment perfectly. "I wanted you to know that I understand now what I almost threw away. Sophie talks about you constantly. Her teacher says you're her biggest inspiration for wanting to learn new things." We stood there for a moment, Not quite reconciled, but no longer enemies. Some bridges take time to rebuild, but the foundation was still there.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.